Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines: Russia intercepts missile in Crimea. Ukraine, on the other hand, continues push in Melitopol. Russia says overnight Ukrainian drone strikes will not go unpunished. Plus, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu says Moscow needs more fire-finding radar to counter Ukrainian artillery, while EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell urges member countries to order more ammunition for Ukraine. Thank you for joining us. Russia has intercepted missiles in Crimea as Ukraine continues the push in Melitopol. Russia claims it has downed a Ukrainian missile in Crimea, while Ukraine said its forces are continuing a push on the Melitopol front. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, Russian forces struck Ukrainian command points and intelligence outposts with high-precision, long-range, air-based and sea-based weapons and repelled Ukrainian offensives on multiple fronts. The ministry adds that Russia's air defense forces also downed UAVs in multiple regions, including Bryansk, and intercepted a missile in Crimea. Russia also claimed to have sunk an enemy landing boat east of Snake Island with an Su-30 fighter jet. However, the Ukrainian state media reported that the Special Operations Forces have denied the information. Meanwhile, Ukraine's air defenses said to have intercepted most Russian drones and missiles that attacked Kiev, according to local media. Multiple regions, including Odessa, were also attacked by Russian missiles and drones. The General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces said in a report on Wednesday that Ukrainian troops continued their push in Melitopol and repelled Russian offensives in Bakhmut and other eastern fronts. According to the report, Ukraine also struck their adversary on anti-aircraft missile systems and other targets. Meanwhile, Moscow's city mayor says Russian air defenses have destroyed a drone on its approach to the capital city. Mayor Sergei Sobyanin says the air defense systems in the district, located around 60 kilometers from the Russian capital, destroyed a drone flying towards Moscow. Russia's defense ministry said in a later statement that the drone was Ukrainian and there were no casualties or damage. The independent online news outlet Medizona, citing flight timetable data, reported that over 100 flights at Air Moscow airports had been delayed amidst the drone's attempted flight toward the city. Vnukovo International Airport imposed flight restrictions on Thursday today and redirected some flights that were en route to the Russian capital, according to the state-run RIA Novosti news agency. On Wednesday, several Russian regions were targeted in a large-scale overnight drone attack, including the Pskov region near the border with Estonia, where a Ukrainian drone damaged at least 2 military planes at an airport. The airport, roughly 700 kilometers from the border with Ukraine, had resumed regular services as of this morning. In the meantime, Russia's foreign minister says drone attacks on Russian territory overnight will not go unpunished. Maria Zakharova tells journalists Ukraine is responsible and says attacks so far inside Russia would have required intelligence from Western countries. Some of the drones which attacked Russia overnight struck an air base in Pskov, some 600 kilometers from Ukraine. Ukraine launched drone strikes across 6 regions overnight in Russia. In a call with reporters, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says Russian President Vladimir Putin receives constant updates about such strikes. According to news agencies, Russia is working out where the Ukrainian drone attacks are being launched from in order to prevent further strikes. Ukraine is yet to comment on the overnight attacks which hit the regions of Moscow, Pskov, Bryansk, Kaluga, Oryol, and Ryazan.
Last night, the Kyiv regime conducted several drone attacks on objects in a range of Russian regions. The actions of the Ukrainian regime would not go unpunished. Russian law enforcement structures are investigating and properly documenting all facts of shelling by Ukrainian militants of Russian regions and their other criminal actions.
And Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu says Russian forces fighting in Ukraine urgently need more counterbattery radar to resist Ukrainian artillery fire. He made this known during an inspection of a military-industrial plant in Russia's Tula region. Footage of Mr. Shoigu visiting the enterprise was released by the Russian Defense Ministry on Wednesday. The plant, which is a part of the state-owned Almaz Anti Corporation, manufactures radar systems. Shoigu demanded the company move to round-the-clock operations to boost production.
As you know, the most important role during the special military operation in Ukraine is played by counter-battery fire. Our troops need all necessary means to wage against it. These are the artillery reconnaissance radars in conjunction with adequate weapons and ammunition, which we need now to conduct efficient counter-wire operations.
Нам необходимо на сегодняшний день для ведения эффективной контрбатарейной борьбы.
Meanwhile, EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell is urging member countries on Wednesday to order more ammunition for Ukraine, as figures show the bloc is a long way from a March target of giving Kyiv 1 million artillery shells within 12 months. Mr. Borrell says overarching agreements known as framework contracts had been signed with arms firms to allow EU member countries to place joint orders for 155mm rounds urgently needed by Ukraine as it fights Russia's invasion. In a landmark step, EU countries agreed in March on a plan worth some 2 billion euros to provide 1 million artillery shells or missiles to Ukraine within 12 months. The first element involved countries digging into their reserves or buying stock from elsewhere. Mr. Borrell said the element had yielded some 224,000 ammunition rounds and 2,300 missiles, worth a total of some 1.1 billion euros. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has decried what he calls corrupt decisions made by medical commissions that assess whether Ukrainians are fit for service in the military. Speaking during his nightly address, Mr. Zelensky says the number of medical exemptions from military service granted in some regions had increased tenfold, and that law enforcement had documented instances of officials receiving bribes worth thousands of dollars. Ukraine introduced a general mobilization after Russia's February 2022 full-scale invasion, and military reservists between the ages of 18 and 60 are eligible for conscription. The military has been hit by scandals involving graft or heavy-handed recruitment tactics. Mr. Zelensky signed a decree earlier in August formalizing a decision to fire all the heads of regional recruitment offices after a nationwide investigation turned up scores of cases involving corruption and abuse. Joining us now is Ambassador Joseph Fayalogu, Nigeria's former ambassador to Switzerland and the United Nations in Geneva. Good morning, and thank you for making out the time to be with us today.
Good morning, Olumide. Morning.
It must be that information that a mother does not want to hear, that her son, who is not a fighting man, is going to be conscripted to the army. Now, we know that in the army, not all soldiers, not all military men are going to be on the field. There are military support services. There are doctors in the military. There are people who do work of a more research and scientific nature. But in this case, where the net has been increased to include a higher demographic for men to be conscripted into the Ukrainian army, what are your impressions of the situation in Ukraine thus far?
Well, with regard to conscriptions, I have some experiences about it. I know that's part of the trend. Well, that's what happens when you have any war, whether war between countries or civil wars and so on. Some people might feel justified that a war is justified, but they may not always feel like they should be part of actually fighting it. There's always the fear, like you mentioned, mothers who don't want their children to die argue, they're my first and only son. I would prefer not that he doesn't go to the war front or go to fight or join the forces. So that's that. But of course, the war is there. Is for Ukraine. It's an existential war. They have to fight it, and they have to have human resources to do the fighting, and that's why Zelensky must be worried about graft and a little bit of corruption in making sure that they have a regular stock of fighting men and women. So, what's happened? What his worry is a genuine worry, and I'm sure that he would find a way around it. It is not to say that Ukrainians generally are scared of the war. They don't want the war, but they realize mostly that the war is with them. And they've, in their past histories, they've had struggles with Russia, and they have also given their beat blow by blow. So it's going to happen. It's going to happen this time. We would merely see it as big. There's going to be some internal struggles anyway with families who want to go to war or not, and so on.
Ambassador, does this present a dilemma for the Ukrainian government where in cases where, as has been documented historically, famous people not in the public eye as well, don't want to be conscripted into the army for reasons including religious reasons, political reasons? Remember, Muhammad Ali didn't want to fight for the United States, and you saw what happened when he had to give up his title belt because he didn't want to go to Vietnam. He had a religious, to his mind, a very sound reason of not supporting the war, and his rights as a person was going to be infringed on if he was forced to go to the war. Do countries, governments have a responsibility to try and appeal to their people to take this very arduous decision on board to actually be a part of the army in these sorts of situations when their beliefs run to the contrary?
Well, yes, people. I know people have used religion to argue that they wouldn't want to go actively into war, but it's neither here nor there. We've seen religious wars. So, in the past, there are so many reasons people could give. Some of them not often tenable, but the state that has to pursue these wars know that they need to always to find a way of dealing with these challenges and get to the core responsibility of raising enough army, because you need boots on the field, on the ground. So if you begin to make too many exceptions based on religion or so many, you will undermine, the state is likely to undermine its capacity to raise soldiers. And the fact is that in many societies, once there is war, the rule of civility changes. The government knows that they have to fight and feel they have to fight, and they have to have soldiers, and they make rules. At times you might consider draconian or infringing human rights or religious rights, but well, let me say that's what it is.
The EU are talking about increasing ammunition supply for Ukraine. NATO also has told this hardline stance against Russia in supporting Ukraine with weapons. We've seen the demonstrations in Germany. We've seen the disagreements with the Brazil president and others who are of the mind that continuous supply of weapons is prolonging this war. For those who will criticize the EU and NATO for not doing enough in the way of mediation, where do you stand?
Well, where I stand, first of all, the war has moved to a higher crescendo now. There's a lot of both parties are looking out for artillery and various forms of military hardware. Russia, even the powerful Russia, is going to North Korea to arrange arms. Of course, the EU has identified the need to rack up and get up to the 1 million artillery shells also that were promised, which have not been delivered. So there is, once the war continues, there is always going to be need for the hardware for war, which is unfortunate anyway. But with regard to whether it is the delivery of weaponry that is causing the war or spending the war, that is arguable both sides. If, for instance, one of the parties say, okay, no wars, let me, and the key party to say so is the party that the aggressor party, and say, well, we're now withdrawing, we've changed our minds, we would move out from the Ukrainian territory that they were not meant to be there in the first place, then the war would almost totally end. But once that doesn't happen and the attempts to negotiate has been frustrated because of this entrenchment of the parties in holding on to their reasons and justifications for fighting the war, then largely it has not been possible to really negotiate or come to a fruitful negotiation. So the war continues, and it looks like this is a war that will continue for quite some time till both parties get tired or one party gets very tired and decides to come to its senses and to end the war. That's definitely the scenario.
We hope that happens in some way, form, or fashion, and as quickly as possible with minimal loss of life. Crimea has been a vacation spot for many Russians since its annexation from Ukraine. We've seen pictures of fathers taking their children for holiday in Crimea. We've seen them at the beaches, at the waterfront. But now, in spite of the fact that there's the attacks on Crimea, some still want to go there for vacation from Russia, but they can't go as easily or as quickly as before in the cases where flights are suspended because of the drone attacks. These increased attacks against Crimea and Russia, Moscow, by Ukraine via the use of drones, is this helping their cause as the counteroffensive continues, or will it just aggravate Russia more to persist in their attacks on Kyiv?
Well, the fact is that there's a war going on, and in war, almost everything is fair. And of course, you cannot have a war in your doorsteps or in a land that you consider yours, and then people are going to have parties. They just carry, and it looks like you're trivializing the issue. But of course, the Ukrainians must have decided on the strategy to really go a little bit further ahead, and they feel justified in attacking in Crimea because they feel they are trying to recover their lost territory, which they should not have lost in the first place. So we haven't seen any attack into real Moscow territory. We're seeing them largely in territories that are contested, including the various territories of the Donbas region and, of course, Crimea. And Crimea is a beautiful place. I have visited there a couple of times, and it's sad that holidaymakers from both Russia and the rest of Europe, and even various from other countries, cannot go there because of the war, which brings home to us the negative impact, the sad impact of beginning a war in the first place.
Ambassador, if there was ever any doubt that there's a crisis of regime change in Africa, surely this military takeover in Gabon has dispelled it. Keeping in mind that the Wagner mercenary group have been instrumental in stabilizing security in some of the countries where they are operational, what is your assessment of the African situation vis-a-vis the Gabon military takeover and the threat of Wagner being seen as being too weak now to protect those areas where they've helped the governments of the day?
Well, if you go into the details of the various coups in West Africa now, well, in the Africa sub-region, you'll find that they have various nuances. But largely, it is a coup in a country where the majority of the populace seem to have got tired of the way they've been governed. With Gabon, it is almost, it's more so a case where there is general dissatisfaction among the populace, like, look, we've had enough. Now, the Bongo family has been there for over 50 years, and now the president wanted to extend it again through an election that was definitely not clean, fair. So it's not surprising that has, happened. Even though we all don't want forceful constitutional changes. But then when civilians begin to try to change the constitution and do the wrong things, both politically and economically to the society, then everything could happen, and one of that is a coup. Well, the impact of the Wagner group, I have always asked myself, what are they protecting? The fact is that Wagner group is obviously the Soviet, the Russian military arm in Africa, in Africa, in the West Africa sub-region, and that frankly, they shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be in Africa doing anything. If there is going to be any protection to be done, ECOWAS or AU can decide that this is necessary and provide the resources for it. So whether it's the Wagner group or the French group or the American military stations that are in these African or West African countries, they really deep down shouldn't be there. I think this is about time that Africa should be let to sort out its own problem with regard to the so-called protection, because we actually know that they are not protecting this country. They are just protecting their specific interests.
Ambassador, but Wagner was called in some of these cases because the security situation couldn't be handled by the militaries of those governments, and the African Union could not do anything. In the case of the Central African Republic, for instance, in the case of other countries where it wasn't because they resorted to Wagner because they wanted to, they resorted to Wagner because they had to, because of Wagner's military capabilities at the time. Where does that leave the African Union? If you say that the African Union and ECOWAS should be involved in helping to promote security in African countries with African hands, if they fail to do so, what options do these governments have?
Well, the sad situation is that they have not actually fully addressed that situation. So before we say they failed, well, they haven't done it at all, and they should be doing it. Because the flip side of it is to have foreign mercenaries roaming all over the continent or region, carrying on like though they are protecting you, whereas they are busy protecting mine areas and so on. Yeah. Of course, evidently they have not stopped any coup. There were about 3,000 of them in Niger. They didn't stop the coup. So my personal opinion is that it's about time that Africa and the various regions should take its responsibilities seriously. The responsibilities of the so-called protection we are talking about, and that if we find foreign intervention, either militarily or politically, we should all together speak with one voice and say no to that.
Indeed, a message that should be heard loud and clear across the African international organizations. Thank you so much, Ambassador Joseph Ayalogu, former ambassador to Switzerland and United Nations in Geneva. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Lumire, for having me.
After the break, Ukraine's Kharkiv builds classrooms underground to protect students from missiles. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our sophomore stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, Ukraine's eastern metropolis of Kharkiv has built dozens of classrooms in metro stations to allow some pupils to return to in-person teaching. This move is to shield its school children from the threat of supersonic Russian missiles fired at short range. Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second largest city, had a population of more than 1.4 million before Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Parts of the city lie less than 20 miles from the Russian border. Its northern suburbs were scarred by fighting. Kharkiv schools have been forced to teach online throughout the war, as some Russian missiles can reach the city in under a minute. Not enough time to get from many classrooms to a shelter. According to its mayor, Ihor Terihov, 60 classrooms have been created in Kharkiv's metro stations ahead of the new school year in September, creating space for more than 1,000 children to study in person. North Korea conducted a simulated scorched earth nuclear strike on targets across South Korea in reaction to Allied exercises that it said amounted to plans for a preemptive nuclear strike by the United States. The General Staff of the North Korean People's Army, the KPA, said in a statement that the missile unit fired 2 ballistic missiles and correctly carried out its nuclear strike mission. Earlier on Wednesday, Japan's defense ministry and South Korea's military said North Korea fired a suspected ballistic missile hours after the United States separately deployed B bombers for Allied air drills. The launch comes as South Korea and the United States prepare to wrap up 11 days of combined military drills, which Pyongyang has denounced. The B-1B bombers conducted separate air drills with warplanes from South Korea and Japan. Meanwhile, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre says the U.S. condemns North Korea's latest ballistic missile launch as it violates multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions. North Korea's ballistic missiles are banned by the United Nations Security Council resolutions that have imposed strict sanctions on the nuclear-armed country.
And the administrator for coming today and yesterday to provide all of you an update. As it relates to the missile, we condemn. We've been very clear about this, condemn the DPRK's latest ballistic missile launch. This launch is in violation of multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions and possesses a threat to the DPRK's neighbors and international community. We remain committed to a diplomatic approach to the DPRK and call on DPRK to engage in dialogue, as we have for some time now. Our commitment to the defense of the Republic of Korea, Japan, remains ironclad. With that, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.
Now let's talk to Captain Bish Johnson, retired U.S. Army captain, national defense and military strategist, joining us from Abuja, north-central Nigeria. Thank you, sir, for being with us.
Thank you. Good morning, Olumide. How you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. And I'd like to draw on your military experience for my first question. Well, militarily and diplomatically speaking, is there no country that is going to provide leadership worldwide for issues of such international concern, such as North Korea firing training across the bow of South Korea? The United States is involved. Japan, not in any way friendly with North Korea, involved. The crisis in Ukraine and Russia. Time was that the United States were seen to be the policeman of the world. Well, that has been largely a topic of controversy for the ages, but it seems that everyone is doing anything that they feel to do, and no country is essentially stepping up to the plate to try and dispel tension here, try and dispel tension there. The United Nations seems to have its hands full and doesn't seem to be able to do anything in the way of influence, and other international organizations as well seem to be overwhelmed with all the shenanigans going on across the world.
Yeah, Olumide, thank you again for having me. If you can recall, the whole essence of United Nations was to provide the kind of leadership that you are talking about. But several decades down the road, United Nations has not been able to provide that leadership. The reason why that has been the case is because of the structure of the United Nations, where you have a few countries. Unfortunately, the countries that are actually creating some of the chaos and confusion that we have in the world right now, within veto power, a situation where one country can just veto the decision of hundreds of other countries just by a single vote. So that is why the United Nations has been incapable of dealing with some of the major global issues, as you have alluded to. You see, no country is going to be able to provide such leadership. And the reason is very simple. It's simple in the sense that every country is looking out for their own interests, the interests of their citizens and their country. And so in international politics, my interests and your interests may not be the same thing. And so there's always going to be that collusion of interest. And when interests collide, countries will disagree. And so, unfortunately, when such disagreements happen, you have conflicts, such as the one you see in Ukraine, between the Ukrainians and the Russians. So the world is more averse to having a multipolar world where there are, some kind of leadership in several regions, as against having a unipolar world where, as you have mentioned, the United States being the police of the world. You see how that has been resisted from several other regions because the world is more interested in having a multi-polar world where there are several countries that are making decisions, not just one that is made by one individual country, because the interest of that country is going to be the priority of that country. And the interest of that one country may not always be in the best interest of the rest of the world. And so that will always be the case, and such leadership will always be resisted.
We've reported this morning President Vladimir Zelensky reading the Riot Act to those who would want to facilitate the evasion or the evading of draft by the Ukrainian army, who are Ukrainian nationals, either by way of falsifying their age or by way of being ferried across the border illegally. How difficult is it to keep your country's people in tandem with a conscription policy during wartime?
it's always very difficult. Military service is usually based on act of patriotism. Those who sign up, they know the risk involved in signing up for military service. So you have to have that level of high patriotism to be able to sign up. Now, in some countries, this evasion of military draft is not unique to Ukraine. Even in the U.S. during the Vietnam War, there were some individuals who evaded. As a matter of fact, there's this general perception that rich people who have the most to lose in every country are the ones who usually don't like serving in the armed forces. It's usually like less than 0.1% of the population that usually serve in the armed forces to defend the entire population. Because the problem is, look, they want to enjoy all the goodies and the services of the country, but nobody wants to pay any kind of sacrifice, particularly when it has to do with their lives and that of their children. And that's why you see people taking all kinds of measures to evade military service. So it's not something that is unique to Ukraine. It's usually has happened in several other countries. It's more prevalent during a time of war or conflict. So I'm not surprised that is happening in Ukraine, because not everybody has that level of patriotism to be able to want to go and die for their country.
And speaking of being in combat, we've cited the recent case of the demise of an ace Ukrainian fighter pilot who goes by the sign name or the code name of Juice, who was a national hero, if you like, at this point, where he's so talented, and he was the one that was one of the soldiers, the airline pilots, fighter pilots, who was championing the cause of the delivery of the F-16s to Ukraine. Now, his demise wasn't in active combat. They were training, and there was a collision of aircraft, and he perished. So I'd like you to bring to our attention how easy or hard is it to find a soldier or a combatant who is very talented, maybe more than his peers, in the field of battle. Is this something that you come across a lot during war, or are there some individuals that particularly excel in spite of the fear of the challenges? And then secondly, for the F-16s, it's in the tally of planes you have, and if you're obviously trying to train for battle, it's almost inevitable, I understand, is it, that you lose some planes in training?
Okay, I don't think that I got your second question completely because you were breaking off, but let me address the first question that you asked as to regards to how easy it is to find those who will go above and beyond the call of duty. Yes. It's very rare to find such individuals. In fact, countries will be blessed to have, a large number of such individuals. But unfortunately, that is not always the case. It's always one or two persons who will distinguish themselves and go above and beyond the call of duty in the service of their country. Because military service is, I always tell people, is something that you go in there, with the full awareness that there's a possibility that you may not return home to your family alive. So it takes a lot of courage and patriotism for you to put yourself in that position where you use your life to pay, to protect your fellow citizens. My only thing is, I hope that pilot, that airman, who, even though he died in training, because he was training to go into active combat, although it didn't happen in active combat, but that whole training is, his readiness to go into combat. I hope that, this sacrifice that he has made on behalf of the Ukrainian people, that the Ukrainians are worthy of the sacrifice of that young man. So the short answer to your question is no. It's very rare to find such people that go above and be on the call of duty.
And then my second question was...
The second part, you were talking about F-16s, but I didn't quite get what, yes.
Yeah, my question was that now we understand that not only has been reported, do they have to learn how to fly an F-16, which is one of the most sophisticated machines to fly on the earth, we understand, but they have to learn English as well. They're teaching them English because apparently some of them don't speak good English, and they need to have a good mastery of the language as well in order to fly the planes. And also that as they continue to train, there will be inevitable losses of some training equipment, such as planes themselves, as they prepare to take the battle to the skies with the F-16s. Is this something that Ukrainians need more time to do, to get ready for, or are they being rushed to? Is it too much in too compressed a period of time to think that they can successfully engage the Russians with F-16s in this battle?
Okay. You see, it's always, the military has a cycle, which you have to follow during peacetime. That's why they are constantly training. You don't wait till the war is brought to your doorstep for you to train. You have to make sure that your troops are ready at all times. And it's simply because of what the Ukrainians are going through right now, where they are having a rushed training cycle because they are already in a conflict. The whole purpose of training ahead of time is to avoid a situation like that. But unfortunately, as war drags on, you're going to lose some personnel, you're going to lose some equipment, so there will always be that need to continue to train. And it's even more difficult in the Ukrainian situation because they are now trying to move away from the Soviet type of equipment that they are used to Western type of equipment that the West is now introducing to them. So when you have that significant shift in equipment, particularly during conflict and during time of war, you're going to have to go through a crash program to be able to get ready and get into the battlefield. Now, having said that, I think that the most difficult part of their training is this language training, where they will now have to learn how to speak English to be able to use these F-16s, because obviously a lot of the manuals and some of this communication softwares and stuff like that are going to be in English, because the origin of that aircraft is an English-speaking country, the United States, of course. But I would say this, because you are not training pilots from the scratch on how to fly an aircraft. Ordinarily, what will be required and the number of time that will be required, how long it will take to train them up, to me, will be reduced, because they are not training from the scratch on how to fly an aircraft. They are just only training to be able to migrate from a particular aircraft platform to a different platform. It's like, say for example, we were used to driving a Soviet-built vehicle, that used to have manual gear, and then now you want to shift to drive to a US-built vehicle that is automatic, because you already know how to drive, right? You already know how to drive. It will be much easier for you to drive that US vehicle when you compare it to someone who never knows how to drive at all, now want to drive the US-built vehicle. So I think that the most difficult part for them is the language training, because obviously, the older you get, the more difficult it is for you to learn some basic things, particularly language. So I think that is where bulk of their difficulty is going to be, not necessarily how to fly those aircraft. And I understand those aircraft are sophisticated, but some of the things that those aircraft does are also automated. When you compare to the old platforms that they have been using that have to be manual, some certain systems have to be manually operated.
That's a perfect analogy, Captain Johnson, just like driving on the right side of the road or the left side of the road in different countries where it's different. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. It's much appreciated. Captain Bish Johnson, retired U.S. Army Captain, National Defense and Security Strategist, who joined us from Abuja.
Thank you very much for having me, Olumide. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. You too. When we return, Moscow Zoo announces birth of the first ever giant panda cub born in Russia. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're getting down to brass tacks with Channels Television business correspondent Laddie Williams joining us to give us some more information, possibly analysis, on the situation with the Russia invasion.
Exactly.
As far as, good morning.
Morning.
Russia's GDP grows 5% in July and 2.1% in January to July. Help us break down the data.
Yeah, so, definitely everyone's been expecting, the Russian economy to get hit bad, with all the sanctions we've seen, from the US and Europe at this time. And we've seen how they turned off, gas supplies to Europe, losing that market, and, turning to China. Then at the end of the day, losing such a big market, and we've seen in January this year, the economy grew by 2.7%. We saw February 2.6%. Then there was a contraction. That was in March this year. April 3.6%. May. Then it starts getting higher, 5.8%. June 5.7%. We see July there 5%. So the first 7 months, they're estimating the economy will grow about 2.1%, and that's compared to 1.6% that we had, in 2022. So we're seeing growth, and definitely 2022, the sanctions were quite heavy, on Russia that time. But now we've seen they've been able to, manage, find ways to evade some of these sanctions, in 2023, like we're seeing, right now with that oil price cap, about $60. But we've seen that, they've been able to sell above that. The reports that they've been able to sell above that price, for a while this year. And we're also seeing right now they're flooding the markets with, cheap grains. And we're also seeing that, most of these sanctions, that have impacted how they, settle payments. We've seen them, come up with that digital ruble. They've ramped up, that one, looking at, making it work sometime, next year.
How far along do you think they've gone with that? Is that a viable alternative or too risky?
It's quite, it's going to take a while before that even, takes on, because at the end of the day, we've seen CBDCs, from Nigeria, we've seen even in China, but adoption, still remains an issue. But for Russia, they're saying we're going to use it for international settlement. Citizens, you're not allowed to use digital ruble. This is just for, international settlements. And also when it comes to cryptocurrency, they're trying to, exclude the citizens from using that. So, but, adoption won't be a problem for them because they want to be able to use that for international settlement. So at the end of the day, some analysts believe that, most of the data coming out of Russia, at this time, some are quite, sugar-coated. That's what they're saying. But at the end of the day, we know the sanctions are biting, but they're still finding ways to manage these sanctions. So the forecast we're seeing right now is about 1.5 to 2.5% growth for the whole of 2023. That's what they're expecting, for Russia.
For the jobless rate, it seems to have recorded a record low this time. The labor market is strained.
Yeah, it's quite strained.
Because the young men are nowhere to be found?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, with the military mobilization in Russia there, we've seen a lot of, millions of citizens actually, leave the country. That's in Russia. And basically in their thousands, they've left Russia. And we've also seen that, the military is taking most of the workers that are supposed to be in other productive parts of the economy. They've had to absorb them, into the military so that they can, help in fighting this war. But at the end of the day, it definitely has an impact, because if you're taking workers away from, productive activities, putting them in the military, then you would have those those sectors actually suffer. And definitely we've seen Russia ramp up spending on defense, about $100 billion at this point. So that's huge. They've gone above their usual, 2%. That's for defense spending. They've gone to about 10%, at this time. So definitely the economy is going to feel the impact of that. And we're starting to, see that, gradually. But
that's the vacuum.
Defense spending is still ramping up at this time.
People are smiling to the bank. The defense...
business of war at this time.
Yes. Thank you, Laddie Williams.
Thank you.
Channel Television business correspondent. Finally, Moscow Zoo has announced the birth of the first ever giant panda cub born in Russia. Typically, a panda will have its first cub between 8 and 10 years of age, but the birth of this peculiar one, due to the panda's age, Ru Yi and Ding Ding, those are their names, are 7 and 6 years old. Given the difficulty with mating that giant pandas are well known for, the birth of any panda cub is always seen as a great success and is often the result of arduous work by specialists. Ru Yi and Ding Ding arrived in Moscow in 2019 to mark the 70th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Russia and China. The adult pandas were put together this spring while an expert on panda breeding came to Moscow from China to control and monitor the process. And the results, new panda baby. And that's where we leave it on today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many thanks to you, our viewers, for watching. Our guests, our producers, do have a good day, and do join us again tomorrow.